Welcome back to Crowned Black Heroes, where we uncover the legendary stories that Hollywood and history books tried to erase. Today, I'm going to tell you about a man who was born a slave, escaped to freedom, and became the most feared and respected lawman in the entire American West. This man arrested over 3,000 criminals during his 32-year career. He killed more than a dozen outlaws in gunfights and was never wounded once. He spoke multiple Native American languages, was a master of disguise, and could shoot with both hands using twin Colt 45 revolvers. He patrolled 75,000 square miles of the most dangerous territory in America, a lawless land where murder was common and justice was rare. And when his own son committed murder, this man did something that showed the true meaning of justice and integrity. He arrested his own son and brought him to trial, knowing it would destroy his family, but refusing to compromise his principles. This man's life inspired the legend of the Lone Ranger, yet for over a century, almost nobody knew his name. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we bring you these incredible untold stories every single week. And if this story amazes you, if it makes you realize that everything you thought you knew about the Old West was incomplete, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me what you think. Now let me tell you about Bass Reeves, the black cowboy who became the greatest lawman the American West has ever seen. We begin in 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas, in the heart of the slave-holding South. Bass Reeves is born into slavery on a plantation owned by William Steele Reeves, a farmer and politician. Bass's mother and father are enslaved, which means Bass is born into bondage, legally considered property from the moment he takes his first breath. His childhood is spent working on the plantation, doing whatever labor enslaved children are forced to do. There's no school for enslaved children, no chance for education. The law actually prohibits teaching enslaved people to read and write because educated slaves are considered dangerous to the system. Bass grows up strong and tall, eventually reaching 6 feet 2 inches in height, which is enormous for that era when the average man stands around 5 feet 7. He's broad-shouldered, powerfully built, and as he reaches adolescence, it becomes clear that Bass has extraordinary physical abilities. He's faster and stronger than most men. His reflexes are lightning quick. His eyesight is exceptional, and he has an instinctive understanding of tracking, of reading signs in nature, of understanding terrain and navigation. These abilities will later save his life and make him legendary, but as a young enslaved man, they just make him more valuable property to his owner. When the Civil War breaks out in 1861, William Reeves joins the Confederate Army as a colonel, and he takes Bass with him as his personal servant and body man. This is common practice for wealthy Confederate officers who bring enslaved people with them to war to cook their meals, care for their horses, and maintain their equipment. Bass accompanies William Reeves through various Civil War battles and campaigns. He sees combat, though as an enslaved man, he's not officially a soldier. He experiences the chaos and violence of the war firsthand, but he's also observing, learning, understanding military tactics and survival skills that will prove invaluable later. And at some point during the war, something happens between Bass and William Reeves. The exact details are lost to history, clouded by time and conflicting accounts. Some sources say they got into a physical altercation during a card game. Others say Bass simply saw an opportunity to escape during the confusion of battle. What we know for certain is that Bass Reeves escapes from William Reeves during the Civil War. He flees into Indian Territory, the lands west of Arkansas that are home to the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations. These are tribes that have been forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands in the southeast during the Trail of Tears, and they've established new communities in what is now Oklahoma. Bass Reeves lives among the Native Americans for the duration of the Civil War and the years immediately following. This period of his life is crucial to understanding how he becomes the legendary lawman he will be. Living with native tribes, Bass learns multiple languages. He becomes fluent in Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw. This linguistic ability will later allow him to operate effectively in Indian Territory, where many criminals hide among native populations, believing white lawmen can't track them there. Bass also learns tracking skills from native hunters and scouts. He learns to read the landscape, to identify signs of passage that others miss, to move silently through forests and plains, to understand animal behavior and weather patterns. He's essentially getting a masterclass in wilderness survival and tracking from some of the most skilled practitioners in North America. Bass also learns about the cultures, customs, and politics of the 5 civilized tribes. He develops relationships and earns respect. This will prove invaluable because later, as a lawman, Bass will need to work in Indian Territory, and his knowledge of and respect for native peoples will allow him to do what white lawmen cannot. He can enter native communities without immediately creating hostility. He can communicate, negotiate, and gather information. He becomes a bridge between worlds. After the Civil War ends in 1865 and slavery is abolished, Bass Reeves is a free man. He's about 27 years old, powerfully built, multilingual, and possessing survival and tracking skills that few men of any race can match. He settles in Van Buren, Arkansas, near the border of Indian Territory. He marries a woman named Nellie Ginny, and they start a family that will eventually include 10 children. Bass works as a farmer and livestock trader, building a legitimate life and supporting his family. For about 10 years, this is his existence. He's a farmer, a husband, a father, living quietly and staying out of trouble. But the world around Bass is anything but quiet. Indian Territory is becoming one of the most lawless regions in America. It's a vast area, over 70,000 square miles, that serves as a refuge for criminals fleeing justice in surrounding states. Bank robbers, murderers, horse thieves, and outlaws of every description flee into Indian Territory knowing that local law enforcement from Arkansas, Texas, Kansas, or Missouri has no jurisdiction there. Only federal marshals appointed by the U.S. government have authority to arrest people in Indian Territory, and there are far too few marshals to effectively police such an enormous area. The result is chaos. Towns in Indian Territory are wild and dangerous. Fort Smith, Arkansas, which sits on the border, becomes the judicial center for the region. This is where federal Judge Isaac Parker presides, and Parker quickly earns the nickname the Hanging Judge because of the number of convicted criminals he sentences to death. Judge Parker desperately needs competent deputy marshals to bring criminals to justice, but it's incredibly dangerous work. Deputy marshals in Indian Territory have one of the highest mortality rates of any law enforcement position in American history. They're tracking violent criminals through difficult terrain, often alone or with 1 or 2 deputies, venturing into areas where they might encounter not just the criminal they're pursuing, but entire gangs of outlaws. Many deputy marshals are killed in shootouts or ambushed on the trail. It's work that requires not just courage, but extraordinary skill, judgment, and resourcefulness. In 1875, Judge Parker appoints the first Black Deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi River. That man is Bass Reeves. Bass is 37 years old when he receives his commission. Why does Judge Parker choose Bass? Because by this time, Bass's reputation as a tracker and as someone who knows Indian Territory intimately has spread. People talk about this former slave who can track anyone through any terrain, who speaks multiple native languages, who is absolutely fearless. Judge Parker needs results, and he doesn't care about the color of a man's skin if that man can bring in criminals. So Bass Reeves pins on a badge and becomes a lawman. He's issued a Winchester rifle and 2 Colt .45 revolvers. He trains himself to shoot with both hands, becoming truly ambidextrous. This gives him an advantage in gunfights because he can fire accurately with either hand, can shoot from unconventional positions, and can reload one pistol while firing the other. Bass's territory is vast. He's responsible for patrolling huge swaths of Indian Territory, often traveling hundreds of miles from Fort Smith to serve warrants and arrest criminals. He usually travels with a posse cook and sometimes 1 or 2 other deputies, but often Bass works alone, tracking dangerous men through wilderness. His methods are unconventional and brilliant. Bass is a master of disguise. Because he's black in an era and region where most people underestimate or dismiss black men, Bass uses this prejudice to his advantage. He disguises himself as a cowboy, a farmer, a drifter, even sometimes as an outlaw himself. He infiltrates gangs, gets close to his targets by pretending to be someone else, and then reveals his true identity and makes arrests before the criminals realize what's happening. There are documented stories of Bass dressing as a beggar and limping into outlaw camps, pretending to be lost or injured, gaining the Outlaw's trust, and then pulling his pistols and arresting the entire group. His ability to assume different identities and personas is so effective that criminals who are actively being hunted by Bass Reeves often don't recognize him until it's too late. One famous story tells of Bass tracking two outlaws for several days. When he finally catches up to them, he's disguised as a down-on-his-luck cowboy. The outlaws invite him to their camp, share their food, and talk freely about their crimes, not realizing they're talking to the very Marshal who's been hunting them. After establishing exactly who they are and confirming their identities, Bass pulls his badge and his revolvers and arrests them both without firing a shot. But Bass doesn't always get to avoid violence. Indian territory is filled with desperate, violent men who would rather shoot it out than face the hanging judge. Bass is involved in numerous gunfights throughout his career. The remarkable thing is that Bass is never seriously wounded in any of these encounters. Bullets tear through his hat, his clothing, his saddle, but somehow Bass himself is never hit. He earns a reputation for being invincible, almost supernatural. Outlaws tell stories about Bass Reeves, about how bullets can't touch him, about how he can track anyone anywhere, about how he never gives up once he's on your trail. Some criminals, when they learn that Bass Reeves is hunting them, simply give up and turn themselves in, figuring they'll take their chances with the hanging judge rather than face Bass in a gunfight. Over his 32-year career, Bass arrests more than 3,000 criminals. Think about that number, 3,000 arrests. This isn't just picking up petty thieves. These are dangerous, violent criminals, often armed and willing to kill to avoid capture. Bass brings them in, sometimes dozens at a time. There's a documented case where Bass arrests 17 horse thieves in a single operation, chaining them together and marching them back to Fort Smith. 17 armed outlaws, and Bass brings them all in. During his career, Bass kills 14 to 20 outlaws in gunfights. Different sources report different numbers, but all agree it's somewhere in that range. Each of these is a case where the outlaw chose to fight rather than surrender, and Bass had to defend himself. In every case, Bass is cleared of any wrongdoing because the shootings are justified self-defense or defense of others. One of the most famous outlaws Bass hunts is a man named Bob Dozier, who is wanted for multiple murders and robberies. Dozier is considered one of the most dangerous men in Indian territory, a crack shot and absolutely ruthless. Bass tracks Dozier for months, following leads, interviewing witnesses, slowly closing in. When Bass finally confronts Dozier in 1878, Dozier goes for his gun. The gunfight is brief and decisive. Bass draws and fires faster than Dozier can get off a shot. Dozier dies on the spot, and Bass brings his body back to Fort Smith for identification and to close the warrant. This is how Bass operates. He's methodical, patient, willing to track a man for months if necessary. He studies his targets, learns their habits, anticipates their movements. He uses his knowledge of the terrain and his network of informants in native communities to gather intelligence. And when he finally makes his move, he does it decisively, giving criminals the chance to surrender but ready to use lethal force if they resist. Bass's reputation grows not just for his effectiveness but for his fairness and integrity. In an era when law enforcement is often corrupt, when marshals sometimes abuse their authority or show favoritism based on race or political connections, Bass is known as absolutely incorruptible. He treats everyone equally under the law. He arrests black criminals, white criminals, native criminals, without regard to their race or background. If you've broken federal law and there's a warrant for your arrest, Bass will find you and bring you in. This fairness earns him respect even from the communities he's policing. People know that Bass Reeves will never plant evidence, will never arrest innocent people to meet quotas, will never use excessive force unless absolutely necessary. He's tough but fair, and in a lawless region, that kind of integrity is rare and valuable. But Bass's commitment to justice is tested in the most painful way possible in 1902. His son, Benjamin "Benny" Reeves, gets into a domestic dispute with his wife. The argument escalates, and in a moment of rage, Benny kills his wife. It's murder, clear and simple. When Bass learns what his son has done, he faces an impossible choice. This is his son, his own flesh and blood. Bass could potentially help him escape, could use his knowledge of Indian territory to hide Benny where no one could find him. Many lawmen, faced with a family member's crime, would look the other way. or find some way to help their relative avoid justice. But Bass Reeves is not most lawmen. Bass believes absolutely in the rule of law, in the principle that no one is above justice. His entire career has been built on the foundation that the law applies equally to everyone. How can he enforce that principle for others if he doesn't apply it to his own family? So Bass does something that must tear his heart out. He arrests his own son. Bass Reeves, the legendary Marshal, places his son in chains and brings him to Fort Smith to face trial for murder. The trial is emotionally devastating for Bass and his family. Bass testifies truthfully about what he knows. He doesn't try to minimize his son's crime or make excuses. Benny is convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He serves 11 years before receiving a pardon. Bass visits him in prison but never wavers from his position that Benny had to face justice for what he did. This incident, more than any arrest of any outlaw, more than any gunfight or dangerous pursuit, defines who Bass Reeves is as a man. He's someone who will not compromise his principles even when it costs him everything personally. The pain of arresting his own son, of testifying against him, of knowing that his commitment to justice has destroyed his family's happiness, is immense. But Bass never expresses regret about his decision. He did what the law required, what justice demanded. That's integrity at a level that's hard to even comprehend. Bass continues working as a deputy marshal until 1907 when he's nearly 70 years old. By this time, Oklahoma is transitioning from territory to statehood, and the federal marshal system that Bass has worked under for 32 years is being phased out. Local law enforcement is taking over. Bass takes a position as a police officer in Muskogee, Oklahoma, one of the first incorporated towns in the new state. Even in his late 60s, Bass is still an effective lawman. He patrols the streets of Muskogee for 2 years, and during that time, the town's crime rate drops significantly. His mere presence deters criminals. Everyone knows Bass Reeves. Everyone knows his reputation. Even old and walking the streets of a small town instead of tracking outlaws through wilderness, Bass commands respect and fear from those who might break the law. Bass Reeves dies on January 12, 1910, at the age of 71. The cause of death is Bright's disease, a kidney condition. He's buried in Muskogee. His funeral is attended by hundreds, including many of the lawmen he worked with, Native Americans from the tribes he served alongside, and citizens who respected him. His death is noted in local newspapers, and he's recognized as one of the great lawmen of the frontier era. But then something inexplicable happens. Bass Reeves is forgotten. Within a generation, his name disappears from popular accounts of the Old West. When books and movies celebrate Western lawmen, they focus on white figures like Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, and Pat Garrett, the stories of cowboys and outlaws that capture America's imagination in the 20th century are almost exclusively white stories. The black cowboys who made up approximately 25% of working cowboys in the Old West are erased from the narrative. And Bass Reeves, despite having the most successful law enforcement career of any marshal in the frontier era, is forgotten almost entirely. This erasure is systematic and deliberate. Hollywood creates the mythology of the Old West, and that mythology is relentlessly white. When black characters appear in westerns, they're relegated to minor roles, servants, or comic relief. The idea that the greatest lawman of the frontier era was black doesn't fit the narrative that white America wants to tell about itself. So Bass is written out of the story. Textbooks discussing the settling of the West and the establishment of law and order don't mention him. Museums dedicated to frontier history don't include his artifacts or tell his story. The Hollywood Western, one of America's most popular and enduring film genres, features countless white lawmen but ignores the black marshal who arrested more criminals than any of them. This erasure continues for decades. By the mid-20th century, almost no one outside of Oklahoma and Arkansas knows who Bass Reeves was. His descendants keep his story alive, passing it down through family history. Some local historians and researchers document his career, but their work doesn't reach mainstream audiences. Then, slowly, beginning in the late 20th century, historians begin to uncover and publicize Bass Reeves' story. Books are written, academic papers are published. Organizations dedicated to Western history start acknowledging his contributions. In 1992, Bass Reeves is inducted into the Great Westerners Hall of Fame. Monuments and historical markers are erected. His story is taught in some schools, particularly in Oklahoma. But even with this growing recognition, Bass Reeves remains largely unknown to most Americans. Ask a random person on the street to name a famous Old West lawman, and they'll probably say Wyatt Earp or Wild Bill Hickok. Very few will say Bass Reeves, despite the fact that Bass's career was objectively more impressive than either of those men. Bass arrested more criminals, served longer, and maintained a higher standard of integrity than most of the lawmen who became legends. There's another dimension to Bass Reeves's story that's particularly fascinating. Many historians believe that Bass Reeves was the inspiration for the Lone Ranger, one of America's most iconic fictional characters. The Lone Ranger first appeared in a radio show in 1933, and the character became hugely popular, eventually appearing in television shows, movies, and comics. The Lone Ranger is a masked lawman who works in the Old West, often with a Native American companion named Tonto, bringing criminals to justice. He's known for his integrity, his sharp shooting skills, his distinctive silver bullets, and his dedication to justice without compromise. The similarities between the Lone Ranger and Bass Reeves are striking. Both are lawmen in Indian Territory. Both work closely with Native Americans and speak their languages. Both are known for their integrity and incorruptibility. Both are crackshots who always give criminals the chance to surrender before resorting to violence. Both have reputations that precede them and strike fear into the hearts of outlaws. The creator of the Lone Ranger was a writer named Franz Stryker, and while Stryker never explicitly confirmed that Bass Reeves was his inspiration, historians have found evidence that Stryker was familiar with stories about Bass Reeves and that the timing and details align. Here's the tragic irony. If Bass Reeves was indeed the inspiration for the Lone Ranger, then the most famous lawman in American popular culture, a character known to generations of Americans, is based on a black man. But the character was made white for radio, television, and film because white audiences in the 1930s through 1960s would not accept a black hero. So America took Bass Reeves's story, whitewashed it, and created a fictional character who became iconic while the real man remained forgotten. This is cultural theft on a massive scale. It's not just that Bass was denied recognition. His actual story, his actual achievements, were stolen and given to a white fictional character, and he got nothing. Not credit, not compensation, not even acknowledgement. For decades, millions of Americans thrilled to the adventures of the Lone Ranger, never knowing they were watching a pale imitation of a real black lawman whose actual life was more impressive than anything fiction could invent. In recent years, there's been a push to correct this historical injustice. In 2021, a statue of Bass Reeves was unveiled in Pendergraft Park in Fort Smith, Arkansas. It depicts Bass on horseback, looking out over the land he once patrolled. In 2023, Paramount Plus released a television series called Lawmen, Bass Reeves, starring David Oyelowo as Bass. The series brought Bass's story to a mainstream audience for the first time. Suddenly, people who had never heard of Bass Reeves were learning about this incredible man and asking why they weren't taught about him in school. The answer to that question is uncomfortable but necessary. Bass Reeves wasn't taught in schools because his story complicates the mythology of the Old West that America wanted to maintain. The Old West, as presented in popular culture, is a white space where white men tamed the frontier, established civilization, and created order out of chaos. Black people in this mythology are largely absent or marginal. The reality is very different. The Old West was incredibly diverse. About 25% of cowboys were black or Mexican. Many of the most skilled riders, ropers, and handlers were black men who learned these skills on southern plantations before emancipation and brought them west after the Civil War. Native Americans obviously were central to the entire story, though Hollywood typically portrayed them as obstacles to civilization rather than as peoples with their own complex societies and histories. Chinese immigrants built the railroads and established communities throughout the West. The Old West was a multicultural, multiracial space, and some of its greatest heroes and legends were people of color. Bass Reeves is perhaps the most dramatic example, but he's not the only one. There were black buffalo soldiers who fought in the Indian Wars and protected frontier settlements. There was Cathay Williams, a black woman who disguised herself as a man to serve in the army. There was Nat Love, also known as Deadwood Dick, a black cowboy, whose skills and adventures became legendary. These stories exist, they're documented, they're true, but they've been systematically excluded from the popular narrative of the Old West because that narrative was constructed to serve a specific ideological purpose, to celebrate white American expansion and to justify the displacement and often genocide of Native peoples while minimizing or erasing the contributions of Black Americans and other people of color. Teaching about Bass Reeves, acknowledging his achievements, forces us to confront the inaccuracy of the Hollywood Western and the white-centered mythology of frontier history. It requires us to ask uncomfortable questions about why these stories were hidden and what other truths about American history have been suppressed or distorted. Bass Reeves's life also challenges another pernicious myth, the myth that Black people in the post-Civil War era were unprepared for freedom, that they lacked the capability for leadership, responsibility, and complex work. This myth was used to justify segregation, disenfranchisement, and racial discrimination throughout the Jim Crow era. But look at Bass Reeves, a man born into slavery with no formal education, never learned to read or write, yet he memorizes arrest warrants by having someone read them to him once. He navigates 75,000 square miles of territory without maps. He speaks at least 5 languages fluently. He masters complex tracking and survival skills. He demonstrates strategic thinking, patience, courage, and moral integrity at the highest levels. He succeeds in one of the most dangerous and difficult law enforcement jobs in American history, succeeds so thoroughly that his arrest record is unmatched by any marshal of his era. How does this square with the myth of Black incapability? It doesn't. It destroys that myth completely. Bass Reeves is living proof that the limitations placed on Black people were never about capability but about white supremacy, about a system designed to suppress Black achievement and maintain racial hierarchy. Every time Bass Reeves tracked down a criminal, every time he outsmarted an outlaw gang, every time he arrested someone who thought they were untouchable, he was proving something important. Not just that he individually was capable, but that the entire system of racial oppression was built on lies. If an enslaved man with no formal education could become the greatest lawman of the frontier, what might Black people achieve if they had equal access to education, opportunity, and justice? That's the question that terrified white supremacists then and that makes some people uncomfortable now. Because the answer is obvious. Black people, given equal opportunity, are capable of anything. They always have been. The system of slavery and segregation didn't reflect natural limitations. It reflected white society's determination to suppress Black excellence through violence and law. Bass Reeves's story is not exceptional in the sense that he had abilities no other Black person possessed. It's exceptional in the sense that he got the opportunity to demonstrate his abilities, and even that opportunity was limited and came with restrictions and indignities that white lawmen never faced. How many other potential Bass Reeves were there? Enslaved people with extraordinary abilities who never got the chance to show what they could do. How many brilliant trackers, strategic thinkers, leaders, and heroes lived and died in bondage or in the restricted world of Jim Crow, their talents suppressed and wasted? We'll never know, but we do know about Bass Reeves, and his story demands that we acknowledge the truth about both Black capability and white historical erasure. Before I close, I want you to imagine something. Imagine you're Bass Reeves in 1875, newly commissioned as a deputy marshal. You're 37 years old, born a slave, escaped to freedom just 10 years earlier. You have 10 children to support. You're being sent into one of the most dangerous regions in America to arrest violent criminals, many of whom would rather kill you than be taken to face the hanging judge. You know that as a Black lawman, you'll face prejudice and discrimination even from the people you're supposed to be working with. You know that some white outlaws will be particularly resistant to being arrested by a Black man. You know the danger is enormous and the pay is modest. What do? Bass Reeves pinned on that badge and rode into Indian Territory. For 32 years, he did the job with excellence, with integrity, with courage. He never gave up. He never compromised his principles. He arrested his own son rather than let family loyalty override justice. He faced down the most dangerous men of the frontier era and prevailed, again and again and again. 3,000 arrests, never seriously wounded. A reputation that made hardened outlaws surrender rather than face him. That's not just law enforcement, that's legendary. If this story inspired you, if it made you angry that Bass Reeves' story was hidden for so long, if it made you question everything you thought you knew about the Old West, then I need you to act right now. Hit that like button to help this video reach more people who need to hear Bass Reeves' story. Subscribe to Crown Black Heroes and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you these powerful stories of black excellence that shaped American history. And drop a comment below. Tell me what you think about Bass Reeves. Did you know his story before watching this video? Do you think he was the inspiration for the Lone Ranger? What other black cowboys and frontier figures do you want to hear about? Let's build a community dedicated to uncovering the true, complete history of the American West. Share this video everywhere. Make sure Bass Reeves' name becomes as famous as Wyatt Earp or Wild Bill Hickok. Make sure the next generation learns about the greatest lawman the frontier ever produced. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for caring about historical truth and for honoring the legacy of a genuine legend. Bass Reeves deserves to be remembered not just as a great black lawman, but as the greatest lawman of the frontier era, period. His courage, his skill, his integrity, and his commitment to justice make him a model for all law enforcement, for all time. Share his story, honor his legacy, teach his name to everyone you know, and join me next time as we uncover another incredible story of black excellence that history tried to erase. Until then, stay inspired, stay committed to truth, and keep fighting to make sure that everyone's contributions to American history are recognized and celebrated. Peace.